Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a universe so vast, so ancient, and so saturated with accumulated suffering that even the gods bleed secrets. A place where 10,000 years of war have only scratched the surface of a history stretching back 60 million years, where civilizations rose and fell before humanity learned to build a fire, where the fabric of reality is itself a living or screaming thing fed by the collective fear of every soul that has ever drawn breath across 100 billion worlds. Welcome to Warhammer 40,000, and welcome back to Q on 40,000, where we come to sit together in the dim, comfortable quiet of the far future and let the lore wash over us like a tide that never fully recedes. Today, we are going somewhere very particular. We are going into the dark corners, the places where the light of the Astronomicon doesn't quite reach, or the questions that even the most learned inquisitor would lower their voice to ask. We are going into the 10 biggest mysteries at the heart of this universe, the questions that have haunted players, readers, and lore enthusiasts for decades, the puzzles for which there may never be a clean, satisfying answer. And that is precisely what makes them so extraordinary. These are not simple gaps in the story. They are deliberate voids, and architectural silences built into the bones of this setting by writers and designers who understood that a mystery well kept is worth more than a dozen answers. Every one of these questions has spawned decades of fan theories, arguments across kitchen tables and internet forums, late nights with novels held up in lamplight, squinting at passages, looking for the clue that everyone else missed. We have 10 to get through, each one more layered than the last. Each one leading, inevitably, back to the same terrifying possibility, that the universe of Warhammer 40,000 is not merely dark because of what it contains, but because of what remains hidden within it. And I want to say up front, the reason these mysteries work, the reason they land with weight, instead of just feeling like missing pages torn out of a book, is because of how carefully they were constructed. These are not mysteries born of lazy writing or contradictory lore. They are the result of people who loved this setting deeply enough to understand that some questions are worth asking forever, that some doors are more valuable sealed than open. We are going to walk up to each of those doors. We are going to lay our hands on the old, cold wood and listen to what's behind them. A note on what this is. This is not a list of plot holes or unresolved retcons, as some of what we will discuss today exists because the people writing this setting changed their minds over the decades, and different sources have offered different versions of events that cannot be entirely reconciled. That happens. It is a byproduct of a collaborative creative universe that has been running across multiple editorial regimes and hundreds of contributors over nearly 4 decades. Those inconsistencies exist, and they are worth knowing about. Oh, but that is not what we are here for today. What we are here for is the mysteries that were built to be mysteries. The questions that were placed in the lore deliberately, with care, and maintained across decades of changing authors and editorial direction, precisely because the people custodying this setting understood their value. The distinction matters. A plot hole is something that slipped through. A mystery is something that was invited in. What follows are the questions that were invited. So settle in. Let your mind go quiet. And let me tell you about the things we do not know. Mystery 1. The true nature of the Chaos Gods. What are they really? Begin here, at the foundation of everything terrible. The 4 powers. The ruinous powers. Horn, the blood god, who sits upon his throne of forged brass piled high with the skulls of the slain, who cares nothing for subtlety or sorcery, and everything for the pure, clean act of violence. Tzinch, the changer of ways, who weaves the threads of fate into patterns so complex, so recursive, so deliberately self-contradicting, that even he cannot follow them all to their ends, and who would not want to, because endings are not the point. Nurgle, the grandfather, the plague father, who tends his vast garden of rot and pestilence with something that looks, deeply unsettlingly, like genuine joy. a smile too wide, a warmth too sincere, a god of death who finds in the cycle of decay the most profound kind of love. And Slaanesh, youngest and most devastating, born in a single catastrophic moment of sensation so overwhelming that it tore a wound in the side of the galaxy that still has not healed and probably never will. We are told how they came to be. The explanation the lore offers is almost elegant in its simplicity. Emotions, real and raw and universal, pooled in the dimension beyond the physical world. A parallel realm of psychic energy called the Warp or the Imperium. A sentient life spread across the galaxy, the accumulated weight of all that feeling, all that suffering and ambition and hunger and despair and rage and love, pressed down into that mirror realm and slowly, over millions of years, coalesced into awareness. The Warp is a reflection, and eventually, the reflection began to stare back. Nurgle is described as the oldest of them, born from the species' deep terror of death and disease that has haunted every living thing since the very first organism learned what it meant to decay. That primordial dread, so fundamental to the experience of being alive, accumulated over the longest span of time. Horn crystallized from the constant drumbeat of territorial violence that seems to be the birthright of every intelligent species, ambitious enough to reach for the stars. Tzeentch emerged from ambition and scheming, and the restless mortal desire to change one's circumstances, to outmaneuver fate, to become something other than what you are. And Slaanesh, youngest and in some ways most alien, was born specifically from the Aeldari, a species of such extraordinary psychic sensitivity and cultural sophistication that when they finally, collectively, surrendered completely to the pursuit of sensation, yet the resulting explosion of emotional energy was powerful enough to tear the Eye of Terror into existence, consuming their civilizational heart worlds and birthing a god in the same screaming moment. That is the accepted narrative. And it is, as I said, almost elegant. But here is where the mystery begins to breathe. Because that clean story, satisfying as it might feel at first, opens immediately onto a series of questions for which the lore has no real answers. And the first of those questions is one of scale, and most people never stop to consider it. We are told the Chaos Gods feed on and are sustained by the emotions of sentient beings, not just humanity, not just the races currently struggling across the Milky Way. All sentient beings, everywhere, in the entirety of existence. The observable universe contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies, each potentially hosting billions of inhabited worlds. If the Chaos Gods truly draw their power from every psychic emanation in all of infinite space, they would be forces of literally incomprehensible power. They would be bigger than any galaxy-spanning civilization could conceptualize, let alone resist. The siege of terror would be like a mosquito landing on an ocean and being described as a naval engagement. So which is it? Are the ruinous powers limited to the Milky Way, drawing their power from the relatively small collection of species that inhabit this one spiral arm? Or are they genuinely cosmic, fed by the grief and the rage of every living thing that has ever existed in an infinite universe? The lore is deliberately, almost teasingly silent on this point. Certain sourcebooks have implied they extend across the galaxy, but no further. Others have used language that suggests a universal scope. The contradiction has never been resolved. And the silence itself is interesting, because it suggests that whoever is writing the lore understands that to answer the question definitively in either direction would diminish something. Scale matters in 40k. It is part of what makes the darkness feel so complete. Then there is the question of what came before. The oldest sourcebooks, and certain threads woven through the Horus Heresy novels, contain a hint that gets at something fundamental. The Warp, we are told, was once Karma. In the age of the Old Ones, those ancient and enigmatic beings who had been seeding the galaxy with life and guiding its development for hundreds of millions of years, the Imperium was not the howling madhouse of predatory entities and soul-devouring storms that it is in the 41st millennium. It was navigable. The old ones maintained networks of warp gates and traveled the Imperium with what seems, from the ruins of their civilization, like relative comfort. The entities that would become the Chaos Gods were not yet formed into coherent consciousness. The warp had not yet learned to scream. Something changed it. The accumulation of mortal experience, the slowly rising tide of emotion from billions of inhabited worlds, pressed into that mirror realm and fed the gathering entities until they crossed the threshold into awareness. That is what we are told. The warp responded to what mortal life was pouring into it and became something different. But here is the question that I keep coming back to. Were the Chaos Gods created by mortal emotion, in the way that a pot is created by a potter? Or were they shaped by mortal emotion, the way a river is shaped by the valley it flows through? Because a valley does not create a river. The water was always going to flow somewhere. The valley simply determines the path. If the Chaos Gods were shaped by mortal emotion rather than created by it, but then some predecessor of theirs existed before that emotion arrived. Something was already in the warp before the war cries and the grief and the ambition and the desire began pooling there. And what was that predecessor? What was the warp in its pre-conscious state before it found in mortal experience a means of taking shape? The oldest codex material, now largely non-canonical, or at least of uncertain standing, suggested that the warp as a dimension exists as a fundamental aspect of reality. As basic and as unavoidable as gravity or electromagnetism, a place that simply is because the nature of existence requires both material and immaterial dimensions. If that is the case, then the Chaos Gods are not explanations for the warp's existence. They are consequences of it. Consequences of what happened when mortality began to accumulate in a pre-existing void. Now consider Tzeentch specifically, because he is the one who resists easy categorization most forcefully. He is the god of change and of hope and of ambition and of scheming and of magic itself, and also of deliberate self-defeating contradiction. He is described as a being who plots so many plots simultaneously that some of them must be designed to cancel each other out. He supposedly perceives all possible futures, which means he already knows how every scheme ends before he begins it. And yet he schemes. Why? If you know every possible outcome, if you can see every branching path of consequence from every action, why take any action at all? The most interesting answer the law gestures toward is that Tzeentch does not actually want any specific outcome. He is not working toward a goal. He is working toward the perpetuation of working, the churn of change, the ongoing turbulence of scheming and counter-scheming and possibility and denial and hope and disappointment. That is not the means. That is the point. Yet he is not a god who wants to win. He is a god for whom winning would be the worst possible outcome, because winning would mean the game is over. And Tzeentch, the changer of ways, will never allow the game to end. There is a horror in that which only becomes visible if you follow it to its conclusion. Because it means that every attempt to counter Tzeentch, every victory against his schemes, is itself something he engineered. It's because conflict and reversal and change are the precise things he feeds on. The Imperium defeats one of his plots. Tzeentch is pleased. A demon prince falls. Tzeentch is pleased. His own followers scheme against him. He is pleased, because all of it is change. All of it is motion. All of it is the game continuing. Consider also the question of their relationship to each other. The great game, the eternal conflict between the four ruinous powers, is presented as fundamental to their nature, as essential and constant as their existence itself. They were ceaselessly using mortal followers as proxies in conflicts that have consumed worlds and civilizations across 10,000 years. Khorne and Tzeentch are described as particularly opposed in principle. The god of pure, uncomplicated violence against the god of subtle and patient strategy. Nurgle and Slaanesh occupy similarly opposite registers, the acceptance of decay versus the desperate pursuit of sensation. But why are they at war rather than simply coexisting? The answer the lore implies, without stating directly, is that the Great Game is not ideological conflict. It is resource competition. Every soul that dies in Khorne's name feeds Khorne rather than the others. Every moment of pain and ecstasy that might have enriched Slaanesh becomes Nurgle's gift instead, if the sensations are overlaid with enough rot and disease. The four gods are competing for the same pool of mortal psychic energy. And the Great Game is their mechanism for determining distribution. This means the Chaos gods, despite their cosmic scope, are subject to scarcity. They can be starved, at least relatively, and it raises a question about their theoretical ceiling. Could one of them, given sufficient mortal devotion, simply grow powerful enough to overwhelm the others? To absorb their domains, to become the single dominant entity of the warp? As the lore implies, this is theoretically possible and practically prevented by the self-regulating mechanism of the Great Game itself, in which any power that grows too strong draws the combined hostility of the others until balance is restored. The Great Game is not just competition, it is homeostasis. The four powers are exactly as strong as the game requires them to be, collectively and individually, and the game has been running long enough that the balance is deeply stable. Unless something disrupts it in a way the game's existing mechanics cannot absorb. And there is one more layer to peel back, and it is the one that the setting itself seems most reluctant to look at directly. The Chaos Gods are reflections of mortal experience. They are made of us. Every act of violence anywhere in the galaxy adds to Khorne. Every death and every disease enriches Nurgle. Every betrayal and every scheme grows Tzeentch a little larger. Every sensation and every desperate, grasping pleasure feeds Slaanesh. This is not a metaphor. It is the structural truth of the setting, which means that the Chaos Gods are not separate from humanity. They are not invaders from outside. They are what we make, continuously, through the simple act of being alive and being mortal and feeling what mortals feel. If you eradicated them somehow, destroyed them completely, they would grow back. As long as any species in the galaxy feels rage and loss and hope and desire, the ruinous powers have everything they need to reassemble themselves. The raw materials never run out. They can never run out, because those materials are the experience of being alive. They are not a problem to be solved. They are a consequence to be endured. And the fact that the Imperium of man has built its entire civilization, its entire cultural identity, around the project of defeating them, makes the Imperium not an answer to the mystery of the Chaos Gods, but a demonstration of it. Or Mystery 2, the Emperor's true nature and his secret plans. There is a figure at the center of this universe so fundamental, so deliberately obscured, that even the setting's own most detailed explorations seem reluctant to draw a complete picture of him. He sits upon the golden throne, a ruin of preserved meat and psychic fire, sustained by the daily death of 1,000 psychers, burning like a lighthouse in the permanent dark. His empire calls him a god. It builds cathedrals in his name that dwarf mountain ranges. It sends its sons and daughters to die for his glory on worlds so remote that the light from terror has not yet reached them. His face, stylized and gold and expressionless, is the single most reproduced image in human history. But who is the Emperor? What does he actually want? And what was he really planning before the Horus heresy tore his designs apart? Let us start with his age. As the oldest and most structurally important origin story, repeated across multiple sources, says this: approximately 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, long before anything that modern scholarship would recognize as recorded history, the shamans of ancient humanity gathered together. These were the most psychically gifted human beings who had ever lived. Across thousands of generations, they had been the guides and the seers of early human civilization. Had the individuals who could feel the shape of the spiritual world, who interceded between their communities and the entities that moved in the darkness beyond firelight. And they understood, these shamans, that the growing psychic sensitivity of humanity was beginning to attract attention from the warp. that the next wave of warp entities to turn their hunger toward the young species would be catastrophic. That something needed to be done. They killed themselves. Together, deliberately, or all at once. The combined psychic shockwave of so many powerful souls extinguishing simultaneously created something that had never existed before. A being born from the collective essence of thousands of lifetimes of spiritual wisdom and accumulated power. A new kind of consciousness, continuous and immortal, carrying within itself the memories and the potential of every one of those ancient shamans. The Emperor of mankind. He is, by this account, older than Christ, older than Rome, or older than the first known writing system. He walked through human history as a quiet and sometimes invisible presence, appearing when he was needed and stepping back when he was not, sometimes as a king or a philosopher or a general or a teacher, sometimes simply as a watcher in the shadows while civilizations rose and fell around him. He allowed terrible things to happen because he understood, at his timescale, that premature intervention produces worse outcomes than patience. He was not kind, not in the way that word is understood by ordinary people. Kindness, at his scale and with his perspective, is a luxury that he could not always afford. By the time the age of strife began to break apart, by the time the warp storms that had isolated human worlds from each other began to thin, he had been alive for roughly 12,000 years, carrying the accumulated weight of 100 civilizations he had watched rise and crumble. When the unification wars began on Terra, when he finally stepped out of his long obscurity and began openly building the thing that would become the Imperium, he was already the most experienced and most powerful human being who had ever existed, and he was working toward a goal that he had been thinking about for longer than most civilizations last. Here is where the mystery deepens considerably. Because for all his apparent omniscience, for all his claimed understanding of the shape of history and the necessities of the long game, the Emperor kept secrets from his own sons. Secrets so consequential that when they were accidentally revealed, even partially, the consequences were catastrophic enough to split the galaxy in half. The most significant of these secrets was the Webway project. While his 20 sons were leading 200 legions of genetically enhanced super soldiers across the galaxy in the greatest military campaign in human history, the Emperor himself retreated to Terra. And he descended into a vast underground chamber of his own construction, sat upon an ancient device called the Golden Throne, which he had redesigned for a purpose different from its original function, and began spending his days locked in a state of intense psychic labor, holding open a carefully constructed gateway into the Webway. The Webway is the network of tunnels and passages, built originally by the Old Ones and later perfected and expanded by the Eldari. It allows instantaneous, or near instantaneous, travel between fixed points without passing through the warp at all. The Eldari maintained it for millennia as the cornerstone of their civilization, and even now, in the 41st millennium, surviving Eldari use what remains of it to travel freely in ways that no human fleet can match. It bypasses the warp entirely. Ships traveling through the Webway are not exposed to the Imperium. They are not at risk of possession, of corruption, of temporal distortion, of getting lost in a dimension where time and space have no fixed meaning. What the Emperor was building, in what came to be called the Great Work, was a human extension of the Webway, a new network of tunnels anchored to Terra and extending outward through the galaxy, walled against the warp by his own personal psychic power. If he had succeeded, humanity would have had something no other species possessed: instantaneous, safe, warp-free travel across the stars, no navigators, no Geller fields, no Astronomicon. No need to risk the souls of psychers against the predators of the Imperium every time a fleet needed to move. The central vulnerability of the entire Imperium, the dependence on a hostile and deadly dimension for basic interstellar travel, would have been eliminated. And he never told his sons. Not Horus, his most beloved, the primarch he trusted above all others and appointed as war master, left in command of the entire Great Crusade while the Emperor retreated to Terra, was not any of them. When Horus, deeply hurt by what he perceived as abandonment and silence, asked why his father had stopped fighting at the Crusade's side, the emperor gave him incomplete answers. He cited the necessity of governance. He spoke in abstractions. He did not say, "I am building the future of our species, and I need all of your victories to buy me enough time to finish." Why? This question, why the emperor did not tell his sons about the Webway project, has generated more discussion and more competing theories than almost any other single question in the lore. The most common answer offered is that the emperor feared knowledge of the true nature of chaos would corrupt even his sons. He had built his great crusade on the imperial truth, a philosophy of secular rationalism that explicitly denied the existence of gods and supernatural entities. The practical reason for this is that the chaos gods feed on worship and acknowledgement, that psychic attention is a kind of sustenance for them, and that a civilization of billions that believed in the gods of the warp would by that very belief make those gods stronger. By telling the legions they fought only rebels and aliens, with no supernatural dimension, the emperor hoped to keep the warp's predators starved of his soldiers' faith. But there is a darker possible answer. What if the emperor simply did not trust his sons? But not in the way a parent distrusts a child out of contempt, but in the way that a being who has watched 10,000 years of history might distrust any finite mind confronted with infinite stakes. What if he knew, with the clarity of long experience, that the primarchs, for all their superhuman capability, were still mortal enough to be broken by the full truth? Lorgar craved divinity and found it in chaos. Magnus craved knowledge and found it in sorcery. Angron was driven mad by pain, Fulgrim by ambition, Kurz by the weight of what he could see coming. Were these things the emperor did not foresee, or were they things he saw and accepted as the cost of his larger plan, in the same cold calculation that he had applied to 1,000 previous centuries of watching people break themselves against the weight of history? And then the tragedy arrived. Magnus the Red, the Psyker Primarch of the Thousand Suns, discovered through his own sorcery that Horus had been corrupted, that the War Master had fallen to chaos and was planning a betrayal of cosmic scope. Desperate to warn his father, and denied access to the safe channels that the Emperor had established, Magnus used forbidden sorcery to reach Terra directly through the warp. The resulting psychic shockwave, an emergency transmission of enormous power, shattered the warding structures that the Emperor had spent years constructing around the growing Webway extension. Demons flooded into the newly built tunnels. The Emperor was forced to remain on the Golden Throne to contain the breach. His ability to move freely, to fight, to lead, to do anything except sit and hold back the tide, was gone. The son trying to save his father, using the methods his father had forbidden, out of a love that was entirely genuine, made everything worse. The irony is so complete it feels deliberate, and the setting is not above suggesting that it was. What is the Emperor now? But this is the question that the entire 41st millennium dances around without ever quite confronting. He sits on the Golden Throne. His body is a ruin that no longer functions in any biologically meaningful sense, held together by ancient technologies and the psychic sustenance of 1,000 dead psykers every single day. He is not alive by any medical definition. He is not dead. That's because if he were truly dead, the Astronomicon would go dark, and every ship in the warp would be lost immediately, and the Imperium would collapse within months. He is something without a name, something that has been continuous for 41,000 years, despite the steady destruction of the biological substrate that supposedly contains it. There is an old idea from the very earliest Warhammer 40,000 source material called the Star Child, but the notion was that as the Emperor's physical form deteriorated, his psychic essence was not diminishing, but accumulating, gathering within the warp into something new. Not the same Emperor, not a revival, but a transformed entity, something born from the Emperor's essence, the way the Chaos Gods were born from accumulated mortal feeling, a fifth power in the warp, a god of order and humanity and light capable of meeting the ruinous powers on their own ground and winning. A more recent lore has gestured towards something similar. A figure called the Child of Light, glimpsed in visions by astropaths across the galaxy. A winged figure rising from golden light. A warmth in the psychic dark that chaos forces react to with something that reads like genuine fear. Agents of the chaos cults have been sent to locate and destroy any convergence toward this phenomenon. The word bearers, who understand the mechanics of godhood better than almost anyone, only treat the possibility of its emergence as an existential threat to everything they serve. And there exists, in more recent lore, something called the Terminus Decree, said to be a standing order among the Adeptus Custodes, the warriors who serve as the Emperor's personal guard. The decree states that the Emperor must never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, whether through physical revival, spiritual reincarnation, or ascension into a warp entity, and that any individual or group attempting to facilitate such a departure must be stopped by whatever means are available. The Grey Knights maintain a similar directive. Here is what is worth sitting with about that decree. Precautions are taken against things that could happen. The very existence of this order acknowledges that the Emperor becoming a warp entity is a possibility, not a fantasy. It acknowledges that someone, possibly many people, believes the Emperor could ascend, and that this ascension is something powerful enough that the Imperium's greatest warriors are commanded to prevent it. But why? What would an Emperor ascended into full godhood actually do? Would he become just another predator of the Imperium, the galaxy trading one set of consuming divine powers for another? Would he be the salvation the Imperium has prayed for, literally for 10,000 years? Or would the act of his becoming a warp god, or with all the catastrophic psychic energy that would require, simply break everything that remains? The answer is buried in a man who has not spoken a legible word in 10,000 years, and who sits in the dark beneath terror, feeding the light that keeps humanity from being entirely lost. But perhaps not entirely silent. There is a persistent thread in the lore, running through the Horus Heresy novels and into the 41st Millennium material, one of individuals who claim to have received communication from the Emperor, not through official channels, not through the Astronomicon, or the organized prayer networks of the ecclesiarchy, but direct psychic contact. The character Janus, the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, was reportedly in direct communication with the Emperor before and during the founding of that secret brotherhood. Some elder Farseers claim to have perceived the Emperor's consciousness in the warp. A certain extraordinarily powerful psychers, those who survived their contact with the Imperium long enough to develop genuine mastery, sometimes describe feeling a vast and deliberate attention moving through the warp, in ways that do not match the behavior of any known entity. The Emperor is supposed to be pinned to the throne, his capacity for action limited to sustaining the Astronomicon and fighting the constant demonic pressure around Terra. But the lore has never entirely closed the door on the possibility that he is more active than that description implies. That the mind, even if the body cannot move, remains capable of extraordinary reach when the mind in question belongs to the most powerful human being who has ever lived and has had 10,000 years of enforced stillness in which to develop its capabilities. What has he been doing in the dark beneath the palace for 10,000 years? Yet the answer shapes everything that comes after it, and we do not know it. Mystery 3. The two lost primarchs, the Forgotten and the Purged. In the vast columned hall at the heart of the Imperial Palace, statues stand in rows, enormous and gilded, each one bearing the likeness of one of the Emperor's 20 sons. 18 of those statues are detailed and named and precisely rendered. 2 pedestals stand bare, wiped clean, not destroyed, not removed, but deliberately and carefully emptied. As if someone wanted the absence itself to be visible, as if the void where a name should be was carrying a weight that a name could not. The 2nd and 11th Legions, the Forgotten and the Purged. This is, by almost universal agreement in the community, the greatest unsolved mystery in all of Warhammer 40,000, and it was created deliberately by Rick Priestley, one of the founding architects of this universe, as what he called a deep background unknown, as something to give the setting weight and shadow, a question built without an answer because the question itself was considered more valuable than any answer could be. Here is what we know with something approaching certainty, which is less than you might hope for. The Emperor created 20 primarchs, beings born from his own genetic material, demigod warriors who each contained a portion of his superhuman capability, as each distilled a different aspect of his nature into a distinct and fully realized individual. They were scattered by agents of chaos during their infancy, each one landing on a different world, each one growing up in isolation from their father and their brothers, before eventually being rediscovered and given command of the Space Marine Legion, created from their genetic template. All 20 were found during the Great Crusade. All 20 fought alongside the Emperor and their brothers at some point, and then 2 of them were erased, not killed in battle, at least not in any way that was recorded openly, not defected to chaos in a recognizable sense, erased, every record scrubbed, every mention stricken from the rolls, every statue cleaned of its name and its likeness until only the plinth remained. The legions bearing their numbers were either disbanded entirely, but their surviving warriors distributed among other formations with their memories surgically altered, or they were quietly absorbed into surviving legions with their identities overwritten so thoroughly that not even they knew whose gene seed they carried. And the remaining primarchs, when pressed on the subject, change the subject, or they look at the empty pedestals with expressions that those who have tried to read them describe not as guilt, not as triumph, not as carefully constructed blankness, but as grief. The most substantial piece of direct lore touching this mystery comes from a scene in one of the Horus Heresy novels. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, discovers deep within the labyrinthine depths of the Imperial Palace a pair of sealed doors. These doors are marked with the numerals 2 and 11. When he presses Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's oldest and most trusted human advisor, for an explanation, as Malcador tells him something that has echoed through the community ever since. He tells Dawn that it was Dawn himself, along with Rabut Guilliman, who had previously asked the Emperor for the memories of all surviving Primarchs to be suppressed. Not just the records, the memories. The Primarchs asked for their own memories of their 2 missing brothers to be psychically removed, replaced with a vague awareness of an absence rather than any specific recollection of who those brothers were and what had happened to them. And the reason Malcador gives is devastating in its simplicity, because knowing what had happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs would have threatened the ideals the remaining Primarchs were still fighting for. Not because the information was strategically dangerous, but because it was psychologically unbearable. Because whatever happened to those 2 brothers had been something so terrible, or perhaps something so morally complicated, that even the demigods who survived it could not carry the knowledge without breaking under it. What could that be? What would make a Primarch, a being of superhuman endurance and iron will, ask to have his own memories surgically removed rather than carry the weight of knowing? The novels scatter fragments. In the first Heretic, one of the word-bearer characters reflects in passing on the 11th Primarch, suggesting that killing him in infancy would have prevented a particular shameful future. The phrasing implies not a death in battle, not a heroic sacrifice, but something that produced what is described as shame. Something that the word-bearers, already secretly converted to chaos worship at the point this thought occurs, considered an outcome significant enough to have been worth preventing through early murder. Sanguinius, the Blood Angels Primarch, reflects before the Siege of Terror on why he is concealing the flaw, the genetic curse buried in his legion's bloodline that will eventually produce the Black Rage and the Red Thirst. He says he will not be responsible for creating a 3rd empty plinth. The word 3rd is specific. He is not thinking of one missing brother. He is thinking of both. And he is connecting his own situation.
Actually, before we keep going, I want to pause here for a second and just say that the Cabal mystery is personally one of the ones that got me. Like, genuinely got me. I remember the first time I read about the 2-path prophecy and just sat there for a moment because it reframes everything in the worst possible way. The whole Imperium, the survival, the golden statues, and the feast days, all of it as the second worst outcome. I had to put the book down. If you have a mystery that hit you like that, drop it in the comments. I would love to know which ones. But anyways, let's go back to the video now.
A primarch whose legion carries a genetic disaster in their blood, to theirs. He is implying that their fate, whatever it was, involved something comparable. A genetic problem, a flaw so devastating or so dangerous that the entire legion could not be allowed to continue. This is speculation, and carefully labelled as such. But the structural logic of the law points towards something in the neighbourhood of this interpretation. That the two missing primarchs fell in ways that were not dramatic or villainous, but in ways that were tragic and contaminating. Not Horus, who fell with fire and war, and the screaming banner of betrayal raised for all the galaxy to see. Something quieter, something that the people who loved them most could not reconcile with what they believed about the Emperor and about the Great Crusade. There is also the matter of the Ultramarines' numbers. During the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion swelled to a size that far exceeded any other legion. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the Ultramarines numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Space Marines, a force so large that it made the second largest legions look small by comparison. The other legions numbered in the tens of thousands. The question of where this surplus of Ultramarines came from has never been definitively answered. One persistent theory, circumstantially supported by the timing of the missing legion's disappearance and the Ultramarines' numeric growth, that is that the warriors of the 2nd and 11th Legions, stripped of their identities and their memories, were folded into the 13th. That somewhere in the genetic diversity of the Ultramarines' descendants, in the 100 or more Space Marine chapters that trace their lineage to Reboot Guilliman, there are warriors carrying the gene seed of primarchs whose names are not permitted to be spoken. The empty plinths remain, and the grief that the surviving primarchs carry around them remains. And the reason they grieve rather than rage, and the fact that they chose forgetting over knowing, suggests that whatever stands behind those closed doors is not a monster story. It is a tragedy. And tragedy, in this universe, is somehow always worse than the alternatives. One last thread. In the community, the question of whether the missing primarchs will ever be canonically revealed has been debated since before the internet existed as a place to debate it. The received wisdom for a long time was that they never would be, that the mystery was protected by a kind of gentleman's agreement among the people who ran the setting, that the intentional blank space was too valuable to fill. Rick Priestley, who created the mystery, has said that he deliberately left it as an open question, that its value was precisely its openness. But the Horus Heresy novel series, which has now stretched to over 60 volumes and is reaching the final stages of the war it was built to document, has shown a willingness to engage with previously sacred mysteries in ways that earlier eras of the setting did not. It has given the Emperor a detailed origin story. It has shown the interiors of the Webway project. It has depicted events that were once described only in vague mythological terms with specific, historically legible detail. Each of these expansions has been, yet in the opinion of many in the community, additions that enriched rather than diminished what they touched. Each has been done with enough care that the new detail felt like it was always there, waiting to be found, rather than imposed from outside. Whether the same could be done for the 2nd and 11th Primarchs is a question that will not be answered here, because we do not know. The community is divided on whether they want an answer or whether the question is the point. Both positions are defensible. Both are expressions of love for the same thing, just different aspects of it. What is certain is that the empty plinths and the grief around them are one of the most powerful images in the entire setting. They do not require a story to carry their weight. The weight is already there, in the absence. In the clean stone and the careful erasure and the surviving primarchs who chose, when given the choice between remembering and forgetting, to forget. In Mystery 4, the nature of the warp itself. We travel now into a mystery that underlies every other mystery in this setting, the fundamental strangeness at the absolute heart of everything. We have spoken of the chaos gods who live within it, of the terror of warp travel, of the way the immaterium is shaped by accumulated emotion. But we have not yet asked the most basic question, the one that sits underneath all the others, like the bedrock sits underneath a city. What actually is the warp? Oh, the most common explanation is the one you will find in any introductory codex. The warp is a mirror dimension, a parallel universe adjacent to physical reality, and it reflects the collective psychic and emotional state of all living things within the material world. It is the place where souls go when they die, where emotions crystallize into entities, where the dreams and nightmares of a billion worlds are made physically and sometimes terrifyingly real. Yet it is the source of psychic power and the greatest danger to its practitioners. It is where the chaos gods live, and where demons are born, and where any ship without proper warding will be torn apart by hungry entities the moment its protective fields fail. That explanation works. It accounts for the mechanics of the setting, but it does not answer the question I actually asked, because here is the detail that changes everything. The warp predates the emotions that supposedly shape it. What in the earliest period of the Old One's civilization, hundreds of millions of years before the current era, the warp is described in the lore as calm. Not merely calmer than it is now. Calm. Almost welcoming. The Old Ones traveled through it freely, maintained their webway networks within it, used it as the substrate for a galactic civilization of enormous sophistication. The entities that would eventually become the Chaos Gods were not yet formed into anything recognizable as consciousness. The Great Turbulence, the howling madhouse of predatory entities and warp storms and soul-consuming hunger, came later. It came as the wounds of the war in heaven and the accumulated suffering of sentient civilizations pressed into the immaterium from the material side, feeding the gathering presences until they crossed into awareness, which means the warp existed before the emotions that shaped it. The mirror was present before anything arrived to cast a reflection. And what that means, substructurally, is that the Chaos Gods are not the warp's origin or its explanation. They are a consequence of what happened when the warp, already present, already extending its infinite dark in every direction, encountered the accumulated psychic weight of mortal feeling and was given shape by it. The warp is not made of chaos. Chaos is what happened to the warp. So what was the warp before? What did it contain in those early ages? Those billions of years when no mortal creature had yet learned to feel rage or love or loss? Was it empty, a genuine void waiting to be filled? Or was something already there? Something ancient and pre-conscious and alien to any mortal framework of understanding? The lore provides an almost unbearably tantalizing fragment of answer in the form of a figure called the Outsider. The Satan, those ancient star-eating entities of pure material energy, again were shattered by the Necrons who had once served them. Their fragments were sealed into containment devices and scattered, kept as weapons or curiosities. But before the shattering, in the period when the Satan were still whole and godlike, one of them did something that the lore describes without ever quite explaining. It went mad. Not in the way that things in 40k usually go mad. Not through corruption by the ruinous powers. Not through demonic influence. The Outsider went mad because it consumed the minds and memories of other Satan, absorbing their consciousness into itself, and what it found in those stolen memories, that compressed accumulation of everything the Satan had seen and done and been across their billions of years of existence, was too much to process. Something in what it learned broke it, and it fled, not into deep space, not onto some distant world, but into the deepest and most remote regions of the warp, into the spaces of the immaterium so far from any material reality that no echo of mortal emotion has ever reached them. It has not been seen since. The Necrons will not speak of it. The Chaos Gods, who claim dominion across the immaterium and who name themselves its masters, apparently avoid the region where the Outsider retreated. The lore does not say why. The lore does not explain what the Outsider found in those stolen memories that broke a being capable of casually consuming whole solar systems. The lore does not tell us what waits in the deepest warp for anything that goes far enough to find it. Something dwells in the dark, beyond the dark. Something that predates everything the setting currently presents as ancient. Something that even the ruinous powers will not approach. And the four chaos gods, as those vast and terrible entities that the entire Imperium spends every waking moment fighting, know that it is there and have made their peace with the knowledge by simply staying away. That is terrifying in ways that are hard to articulate. The things that terrify the chaos gods are not things that have names in any human language. The warp's relationship to death is worth exploring in this context. Because it illuminates another dimension of why the warp's true nature matters so much to the living. When a human being dies, their soul, their psychic essence, passes through the warp. This is not metaphor. It is, within the logic of the setting, literal. The Imperium is the place that receives the dead. For most ordinary humans, this transit is brief and relatively harmless. The soul moves through the warp and is dispersed, its energy returning to the background psychic environment. For psychers and for individuals of particular spiritual significance, the transit is more complicated, their stronger psychic presence making them more visible and more interesting to the entities that inhabit the Imperium. For champions of chaos, the afterlife is a kind of damnation that they typically mistake for glory. Their souls are consumed by the chaos god they served, becoming part of its substance, their individual identity subsumed into the greater entity. Whilst this is not generally presented as pleasant or as a reward in any meaningful sense, regardless of what the cults of chaos promise their followers. For the Necrons, there is no afterlife at all. Biotransference severed their connection to the warp entirely. When a Necron's physical form is destroyed, if the backup process fails, their consciousness simply ends. There is no continuation, no persistence, no echo in the Imperium. They are, of all the major species in the galaxy, the only ones who die completely. Whether this makes them the most cursed or the most fortunate depends entirely on your assessment of what the warp's afterlife actually offers. For Eldari, death is a crisis that their entire civilization is organized around managing. Their souls, being extraordinarily psychically dense, are immediately appetizing to Slaanesh, who feeds on Eldari essence with a preference born of having been created from it. Eldari society uses spirit stones, physical matrices capable of catching and holding a soul at the moment of death, to prevent Slaanesh from consuming their dead. The infinity circuits of their craft worlds hold millions of trapped souls, preserved in a kind of technological afterlife, conscious or dormant, depending on the resources available to maintain them. This is not a solution. It is a containment strategy, buying time against an inevitable reckoning that the Eldari have been managing imperfectly for 10,000 years. While all of this is shaped by the nature of the warp. Every civilization's theology, every culture's concept of death and what follows it, every hope of continuation beyond physical mortality, is defined by what the Imperium is and how it behaves. And the warp's true nature, what it was before mortality found it, what lives in its depths, what rules actually govern it beyond the behaviors of the entities that have taken up residence there. It is a mystery that every species in the galaxy lives inside without comprehending. There is one more dimension to this worth exploring. The warp is described consistently as infinite, not very large, not cosmically vast, infinite, without edge or boundary or measurable distance. The material universe, which contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies and stretches across an almost incomprehensible span of physical space, exists within the warp rather than alongside it. Yeah, like a bubble of candle flame in an endless ocean. The material universe is finite. The warp contains it. The warp is not. What fills the infinite regions of the Imperium that have no corresponding material reality? The chaos gods draw their power from mortal emotion, from the physical universe. But the physical universe is a speck in the warp's infinite dark. What is in the rest of it? What has always been in the rest of it? And if the warp is truly without boundary, is somewhere in its measureless dark, some region of it that has never once been touched by any mortal feeling, never once been shaped by anything from the material world, and remains in its original state, the state it was in before the Old Ones arrived, and before the war in heaven, and before any of this. The silence in which those questions sit is one of the most carefully tended silences in the setting. And Mystery 5, the Cabal and the long game of impossible choices. Here is one of the setting's most quietly devastating revelations. Among all the secrets buried in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, one of the most extraordinary is not a question about the past, but about a plan that was set in motion across thousands of years, executed at enormous cost, and then apparently failed. Or perhaps succeeded. That ambiguity is the point. As the Cabal was an organization unlike almost anything else in the lore. Not a faction of a single species, not a military force, not a political bloc operating within the recognizable structures of the galaxy's powers. It was a coalition, a carefully maintained network of more than 1,000 different intelligent species, some of them so alien in their biology and their way of experiencing reality that they could not be said to think in any framework that a human mind would recognize. Some of them were physically incomprehensible. Some of them had been plotting against the same target for longer than humanity had walked upright. All of them were united by one purpose: the eventual destruction of the ruinous powers of chaos. This organization claimed to have been fighting that war, in its own way, for longer than humanity had existed as a species capable of recognizing the threat. It had developed seers of extraordinary accuracy, beings who could perceive the flow of future probability with a precision that made even Eldari farseers look approximate. And what those seers showed, after centuries of observation and calculation, was deeply unpleasant. Two possible futures arising from the Horus heresy. Only two, no third option visible. In the first, the Emperor won. Horus was defeated and cast down. The Imperium survived, but it survived broken and corrupted by the losses of the war and by the institutional calcification that would set in over the following 10,000 years. A civilization locked into slow stagnation, its greatest minds consumed by endless defensive war, its population ground down generation by generation, its capacity for change and growth strangled by the accumulated weight of loss and fear. The Chaos Gods, feeding on the war and on the suffering, and on the very human desperation of the Imperium's continued survival, what would grow stronger gradually, through patience, through attrition, until eventually the slow death arrived. In the second, Horus won. Humanity was destroyed, its worlds burned or corrupted, its population consumed or scattered. But in destroying humanity, the primary food source of the Chaos Gods, the thing that in this era fed them most richly and most consistently, would be gone. Without that sustenance, without the constant supply of human fear and rage and despair, yet the ruinous powers would weaken. Not immediately, not quickly, but over geological spans of time, as the lesser species remaining in the galaxy failed to replace what the humans had provided. The great powers of the warp would eventually thin and fade and become manageable, perhaps even defeatable, by whoever survived. The Cabal's conclusion, after what must have been an almost incomprehensible duration of analysis, was this: it is better for humanity to die quickly and take the Chaos Gods with them than for humanity to survive and serve as the engine of their own cosmic annihilation, stretched across 10,000 years of grinding, agonizing attrition. They went to Alpharius Omegon, the twin primarchs of the Alpha Legion. Of all the Emperor's sons, Alpharius and Omegon were the most suited to this conversation. The Alpha Legion existed in a state of permanent operational ambiguity, their structure built around misdirection and long-term strategic patience. They had the deepest intelligence networks of any legion. They were accustomed to thinking in timescales that other primarchs would find paralyzing. And perhaps most importantly, they were the brothers who asked the most uncomfortable questions, who interrogated the assumptions of the Great Crusade rather than simply executing them. The Cabal laid out its vision. They offered their prophetic analysis. Yet they asked the Alpha Legion to join Horus's rebellion, not because they believed in chaos, not because they wanted Horus to win for chaos's sake, but because they believed that Horus's victory, specifically humanity's defeat, was the only path through which the Chaos Gods might eventually be starved into something approaching death. And by almost all available accounts, Alpharius agreed. Omegon, his twin, appears to have dissented. The twins' response to the Cabal's proposal may have split them, driving a wedge into the single most unified and inscrutable Primarch pairing in the whole 20, sending them toward different conclusions about what the long game actually required. The implications of the Cabal's two-path prophecy, if that prophecy was accurate, are almost too large to process. Because if they were right, then the Emperor's victory at the Siege of Terra, which feels from inside the narrative like the heroic survival of humanity against impossible odds, was actually the worst possible outcome given an only marginally less bad alternative. The victory that condemned humanity to 10,000 years of exactly the slow death the Cabal predicted. 10,000 years of the Great Rift, and the endless war, and the Astronomicon burning lower, and the Chaos Gods patient and growing, and the Imperium grinding itself to dust trying to hold the line. The current state of the 41st millennium fits the Cabal's darker prophecy uncomfortably well. Not a quick death, the long one, drawn out across millennia, the galaxy splitting open with the cicatrix maledictum, chaos pouring through the gap with what appears to be accelerating strength, and the Imperium responding not with renewed vigor, but with the same institutional inertia that has characterized its last 10,000 years. The Cabal saw this, they saw it, and their answer to seeing it was to try to end things faster, more decisively, and with less total suffering in the long run, was the Cabal eventually disbanded. Eldrad Ulthran, the ancient and formidably skilled Farseer of Craftworld Ulthwe, examined their work and their conclusions and rejected them, not because they were wrong about the two paths, but because he believed the two paths they had identified were not the only ones. He believed there was a third option, one that required humanity not to die but to change, and he dismantled the Cabal through targeted elimination of its key membership. Believing that an organization devoted to the deliberate extinction of humanity was ultimately too dangerous to be allowed to continue pursuing its methods, regardless of the purity of its long-term intent. The question that lingers, the one that has no answer but generates the most vertigo when you really sit with it, is this. Was Eldrad right to stop them? Did the Cabal's methodology, the willingness to sacrifice humanity in the short term to save everything else in the long term, represent a monstrous evil that deserved dismantling? Or did Eldrad, in destroying them, eliminate the one organizational force in the galaxy sophisticated enough to actually win the war against chaos, in favor of a third path that he can see the direction of, but whose destination he cannot guarantee? The Cabal is gone. Its prophetic instruments are scattered or destroyed. Its records are lost. The questions it raised cannot be asked to anyone who has access to the answers. And the war continues, as the Cabal predicted it would, consuming everything slowly, one world at a time. But the Alpha Legion remains. Or rather, the Alpha Legion's situation remains unresolved in a way that is unique among all the legions. Every other legion's allegiance in the Horus heresy is, eventually, legible. The Ultramarines and their kin remained loyal. The World Eaters and the Death Guard and the others fell to chaos. When the Cabal's influence on the Alpha Legion created a condition that the existing categories of loyal and traitor cannot properly contain. Were the Alpha Legion loyal? Not by any conventional definition. They fought against the Emperor's forces, participated in the heresy, actively sabotaged Imperial operations. Were they traitors? Also not quite. They were never genuinely converted to chaos, never worshipped the ruinous powers for their own sake, and their stated motivation was the elimination of chaos rather than its triumph. They occupied a position the Imperium has no word for. People who worked against everything the Imperium stood for, in the genuine belief that doing so was the only way to protect what the Imperium was meant to protect. People who committed atrocities, not in service of corruption, but in service of a calculation that corruption itself had to be destroyed, and that the cost was acceptable. In the 41st millennium, the Alpha Legion continues to operate in ways no analyst has been able to model with confidence. They fight against the Imperium. They also, on documented occasions, defend Imperial populations against chaos incursions. They undermine chaos operations in ways that suggest a continuing ideological war against the ruinous powers that predates any currently active faction's understanding of their motivations. The Cabal's two-path prophecy may have been wrong. Eldrad's third path may be real and navigable, or the Cabal was right, and humanity is living through exactly the slow collapse they predicted, with no one left who understands the situation clearly enough to change it. The absence of the organization that was watching the longest game means that no one currently has the perspective needed to evaluate which of those possibilities is closest to the truth. That silence, the silence where the Cabal used to be, is its own kind of answer. In Mystery 6, the Void Dragon and the God beneath Mars. Let us descend now into something almost laughably close to home by the standards of this setting, not a mystery hidden in the darkness between distant stars or buried in the period before humanity learned to write. A mystery sleeping beneath the red surface of the planet immediately adjacent to Earth, as close enough that on a clear night in humanity's ancient past, you could look up and see the light reflected from the world under which it rests. Mars, the Forge World, the industrial heart of the Imperium, the home of the Adeptus Mechanicus, those half-mechanical devotees of the machine god, those figures in red robes who dedicate their lives to replacing their own flesh with superior mechanical components in the pursuit of what they call the motive force, the divine principle that animates all machines, the breath of the Omnissiah in metal and circuitry. They believe the Omnissiah is an aspect of the Emperor. The Emperor allowed them to believe this. He needed them, needed their ancient knowledge and their forge facilities and their standard template constructs to build the ships and the weapons and the armor of the Great Crusade. So he made a political compromise with the Mechanicum's faith, rather than eradicating it the way he eradicated every other religion he encountered. He signed the Treaty of Mars. He acknowledged the Omnissiah as real, at least in a manner sufficiently ambiguous to keep the Mechanicum satisfied. And he moved on. But some Mechanicus scholars, the ones who dig deepest into the oldest and most restricted archives on Mars, the ones whose security clearances give them access to information that has been sealed from general knowledge for 10,000 years, believe something very different. They believe the Omnissiah is not the Emperor. They believe the presence they feel, that resonant hum of mechanical genius that seems to whisper solutions to engineering problems to Martian adepts who pray with sufficient focus and devotion, is something far older and far more alien. Something sealed in the Noctis Labyrinth, at the vast canyon system on Mars's surface, something that has been sleeping in a prison of the Emperor's own construction since before the Unification Wars. The Void Dragon, one of the Citan. The Citan were the star-eating entities of pure material energy who existed before the war in heaven, who devoured suns, who offered the Necrontyre the gift of biotransference and received their civilization as payment. They were, before the Necrons turned against them, among the most powerful beings in material reality, and then the Necrons shattered them, using weapons developed across the entire length of the war in heaven, breaking those enormous entities into fragments that could be contained and used. But before that shattering, the Citan were effectively ungodlike in their power within the material dimension, and the Void Dragon, by most interpretations of the lore, was either the most powerful of them or very close to it, as its domain was the material world itself, technology, the structure of matter, the principles that govern how physical things can be shaped and directed and made to serve. Where other Citan fed on the energy of dying stars, the Void Dragon was interested in what matter could become, the potential locked in the relationship between energy and mass and force. It was, in a sense, the patron principle of engineering and physics made into a divine consciousness. The lore trail is fascinating and deliberately incomplete. We know from various sources that before the Emperor unified Terra, before the Unification Wars even began, a great entity arrived on Earth, something that the Emperor fought, something that even he, the most powerful human being who had ever existed, could not destroy. He could not kill a Catan, not even in its undivided form. But he could bind one, he could imprison it. He did so not on Earth itself, but on the adjacent planet. He sealed the Void Dragon within a Necron-built stasis structure beneath the Noctis Labyrinth, left it there in suspended imprisonment, and walked away. And then something happened on Mars. The population of Mars, which had been isolated from the rest of humanity during the Age of Strife by impassable warp storms, developed a religious and philosophical movement, centered not on the supernatural in any traditional sense, but on machines and the knowledge required to build them. They came to regard technological understanding as a form of sacred communion. They developed the concept of the Omnissiah as the divine intelligence that underlies all mechanical reality. They built a civilization, the Mechanicum, that treated engineering as theology and the standard template constructs as holy scripture. And from that civilization came virtually all of the technological sophistication that made the Great Crusade possible. Yet the question the lore leaves hanging is this: how much of Martian technological genius was genuinely independent, and how much of it was the ambient influence of an imprisoned god of machines seeping up through the red rock? The novel Mechanicum, set during the Horus Heresy, implies strongly that the Void Dragon's imprisonment was not entirely passive, that even bound and unconscious, the creature's fundamental nature radiated something into its surroundings, a kind of inspiration, a pull toward mechanical thinking, a resonance that the people living above it found their way toward without understanding why. The Omnissiah that Martian adepts feel guiding their insights may be real in a literal sense, just not the Omnissiah they think it is. The Necrons know something is beneath Mars. In the year 998 of the 41st Millennium, 3 Necron vessels conducted a suicidal deep penetration raid directly into the Sol system, fighting past its layered defenses and landing at least one craft on the Martian surface before being destroyed. Their objective was never publicly stated. Their mission was categorized in Mechanicus records as an alien incursion of unknown purpose. But the logic of the lore, combined with everything we know about Necron behavior toward shattered Citan, points in one direction. They were not attacking Mars. They were checking on the Void Dragon, evaluating its containment, ensuring that the being the Necrons still regard with the complex mixture of reverence and terror appropriate to a former slave god, remained securely imprisoned. Or perhaps ensuring something else. Perhaps the Necrons were not there to maintain the prison. Perhaps they were there to determine whether it could be safely opened. The Silent King, who leads the Necrons in the 41st Millennium, has made the destruction of chaos and the protection of the galaxy's material dimension his consuming priority. A fully restored Citan, specifically the one whose nature is most aligned with the physical world, an entity that is in its essence the principle of matter over spirit, would be a weapon without parallel against the forces of the Imperium. The Void Dragon, unleashed, would be a god of materialism opposed to gods of pure psychic energy. Well, whether the Silent King would ever make that gamble, and what would happen to Mars and to the Mechanicus' entire theological identity if he did, is a question the lore has raised and carefully declined to answer. There is also the question of what the Mechanicus would do if they discovered the full truth. The Adeptus Mechanicus is not a monolithic institution. It contains factions with wildly different philosophies about the nature of the Omnissiah and the path to technological enlightenment. There are Mechanicus sects that have been hunting for the Omnissiah's physical presence for millennia, believing that the machine god can be found and communed with directly, rather than through the mediation of the Emperor's divinity. If even a fragment of credible evidence reached those sects, suggesting that a genuine, physically present divine intelligence of technological nature was sealed beneath the Noctis labyrinth, the internal consequences for the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the external consequences for the Imperium that depends on the Mechanicus for its industrial base, would be difficult to overstate. The Void Dragon doesn't need to be released to be dangerous. It just needs to be found. And here is the final layer of this mystery that deserves attention. The Emperor bound the Void Dragon before the Unification Wars, before he had the Primarchs, before he had the Space Marines, and before he had the Treaty of Mars, or the Great Crusade, or any of the institutions that would eventually define the Imperium. He did this alone, with whatever resources he had available at the time, and he did it well enough that the binding has held for over 41,000 years. What does that binding look like from the inside? What is the Void Dragon's experience of its imprisonment, if it experiences anything in a recognizable way? Is it conscious? Is it dreaming? Is the resonance that has been permeating through the Martian substrate for 40,000 years an accidental side effect of its captivity, or is it deliberate? Is the Void Dragon imprisoned and patient in ways that only a being whose timescale is measured in stellar lifespans can be patient, simply waiting for the right moment to communicate with the right person? The Mechanicus has been listening to something for 10,000 years. They just don't know what they're actually hearing. As mystery. 7. The Tyranids' true origin. What drove them here? Consider the Tyranids from outside for a moment, not from within the perspective of the species that have to fight them, who understandably experience them as nothing but overwhelming, unceasing hunger. Not from the vantage of the guardsman whose last sight is the shadow of a carnifex blocking out what used to be a sky, or the space marine who can feel the weight of a hive fleet's psychic shadow pressing against his mind like something trying to climb in through a window. Set all of that aside and look at the phenomenon from a distance, from outside the galaxy if you could, as a cosmic event rather than a military one. The Tyranid hive fleets arrived at the edge of the Milky Way from outside it. This is the foundational fact that everything else about the Tyranids branches from. They did not evolve in some remote corner of the galaxy's outer arms. They did not emerge from a dormant state within the galactic disk. They came from the intergalactic void, from the absolute darkness between galaxies, and they arrived not as a scouting force or a vanguard of modest size, but as a predatory migration of a scale that strains the descriptive capacity of any available language. Hive fleet behemoth, the first to make significant contact with Imperial forces, numbered in the billions of individual organisms across its fleet, each ship a living thing, each a component of a collective consciousness spanning a volume of space that would swallow lesser stellar empires whole. And Behemoth was the smallest of the major fleets. The fleets that followed, Kraken and Leviathan, were larger, significantly larger. Leviathan in particular attacked from two directions simultaneously, converging on the galactic core from above and below the galactic plane in a pincer movement that implied a level of strategic coordination occurring across distances so vast that the communication lag alone should have made it impossible. It was not impossible because the Tyranid hive mind does not communicate the way other species do. It does not send signals. It simply is, across its entire extent, simultaneously. It's in the way that a single brain is present in every part of itself, without requiring messages to travel between its regions. These enormous fleets, these species-defining armadas of biological horror, are not the Tyranid civilization. They are more like fingers, probes, the leading edge of something waiting beyond the galaxy's edge, watching through the consumed minds of the organisms it has sent ahead, are learning the galaxy's shape and strength and composition from the experiences of the fleets it is willing to spend as expendable reconnaissance forces. The full scope of the Tyranid civilization, if that word can even be applied to a distributed organism rather than a society, is unknown. The galaxy has seen 3 major fleets and numerous splinter tendrils. The intelligence agencies of every major faction that has bothered to estimate have generally concluded, quietly, and with the specific calm of people trying not to think too hard about what they are calculating, that what has entered the galaxy so far is a fraction of what exists outside it. The Tyranids are not native to this galaxy. They evolved somewhere else, or were constructed somewhere else, or achieved their current form through some process so alien to anything the galaxy has produced that the distinction between evolution and construction becomes somewhat academic. And whatever drove them across the intergalactic void, across the lightless expanse of billions of light years of effectively empty space, has been one of the setting's most carefully maintained mysteries since the Tyranids were first introduced as a faction. 3 main theories live in the lore, each with a different level of textual support, none of them definitively confirmed, and each of them terrifying in a different direction. The first is the most straightforward, which does not mean it is comforting. The Tyranids have been traveling the intergalactic void for a span of time that human comprehension struggles to hold steady. They move between galaxies as a matter of biological necessity, consuming one galaxy's biomass to generate the energy needed for the journey to the next, then consuming that galaxy to fund the journey after. They are not fleeing anything and not pursuing anything. They are not responding to any threat or stimulus except the detection of abundant biomass within range of their collective hunger. They are eating. They have always been eating. The Milky Way is simply the next meal in a progression that began so long ago that the species who witnessed its beginning are gone, possibly consumed. By this account, the Tyranids' arrival is not an event in the story of the galaxy in the way that the Horus Heresy or the fall of the Aeldari were events. It is a natural disaster. The galaxy is simply in the path of something that has been moving in this direction for longer than most of its current civilizations have existed. The second theory is more recent in the lore and structurally more interesting because it introduces the possibility of specific cause. The Tyranids were drawn to the Milky Way by a signal, the Pharaohs, a Necron navigational device of extraordinary power located on a moon in the Sothar system, which during the Horus Heresy era was activated and amplified to guide Imperial fleets through a galaxy whose normal navigational beacon, the Astronomicon, had been made effectively inaccessible by the psychic disturbances surrounding Horus's campaign. The Pharaohs worked by amplifying psychic signals to a magnitude that could be detected across interstellar distances. The novel that bears its name, dealing with the activation and ultimate fate of the device, implies that a signal of that power, broadcast into space from the direction of the Milky Way, was perceivable from outside the galaxy. The hive mind, already moving through the intergalactic dark, oriented on it with the precision of a navigational fix. This theory does not answer why the Tyranids were already moving through the void. It answers only why they came here rather than somewhere else. The hunger was already present. The Pharaohs merely provided the address. The third theory carries the most existential weight and is the one the lore approaches most indirectly, as if it is something that cannot be looked at directly without causing some kind of conceptual injury. Something drove the Tyranids out of their home, not resource pressure, not the logic of metabolic necessity. Something chased them. Something that the hive mind, a collective consciousness capable of simultaneously directing billions of organisms across a front measured in light years, considered a sufficient threat to justify crossing the void between galaxies. Something that made the intergalactic crossing, a journey of millions of years through empty space, in bodies sustained by consuming everything within reach, the option preferable to staying. What could that be? What exists in whatever galaxy the Tyranids came from, that a consciousness which has consumed whole worlds and directed the evolution of thousands of species found worth running from? What is large enough and terrible enough and sufficiently immune to being eaten that the hive mind looked at it and chose distance over engagement? The lore does not say. It gestures at the question and then deliberately, carefully, stops before answering it. The silence is its own kind of answer, that what waits beyond the galaxy's edge is a mystery the setting's writers considered more valuable sealed than explained. Now consider the Tyranids' relationship with the warp, because this is the detail that changes the shape of every other question about them. They have none. Or rather, the hive mind has no warp presence in the conventional sense, and the species it controls, carry no individual psychic weight in the Immerterium whatsoever. This is not a small mechanical detail tucked into the corner of a codex. This is structurally extraordinary. Every species in the galaxy of any psychic sensitivity, humans, Aeldari, orcs, even the minimally psychic Tau, casts a shadow in the warp, a reflection of its collective psychic weight, its emotions, and its dreams, and its deaths. That reflection is how the Chaos Gods feed. That reflection is how psychers access the powers of the Immerterium. It is the price of being alive and thinking in a universe where thought itself has physical consequences. The Tyranids pay no such price. Or rather, they have found a way around it that no species in the galaxy's history has managed. The hive mind operates on a frequency that the warp cannot read or consume. Individual organisms have no autonomous psychic presence because they have no autonomy. They are extensions of the hive mind, and the hive mind itself operates in a register that sits completely outside the Immerterium's interaction range. The practical consequences of this are devastating. The advance of a hive fleet is preceded by what is called the shadow in the warp, a zone of psychic interference so complete that the normal signals traveling through the Immerterium become incoherent or disappear entirely. Astropaths attempting to transmit through it find their messages swallowed. Navigators trying to perceive the Astronomicon through it describe the experience as going blind in a way that leaves no sensation of darkness, just the absence of everything that used to be there. While psychic powers become unreliable, then useless. The warp in a region dominated by Tyranid presence is not turbulent. It is simply quiet, absent, empty in the way that a room is empty after something has eaten everything in it. The Chaos Gods notice this. How could they not? The warp is sustained by psychic emanations from mortal life, and the Tyranids, rather than contributing to those emanations, extinguish them, and every world consumed by a hive fleet stops generating the emotional and psychic output that feeds the ruinous powers. The shadow in the warp is not just an absence of signal in the Immerterium. It is the growing silence of a feeding ground being stripped bare of everything that was sustaining it. There is a possibility here that the law permits rather than states outright. But that becomes difficult to dismiss once you follow the logic all the way through. The Tyranids may represent an existential threat not primarily to the material species of the galaxy, as terrifying as their appetite is for those species, but to the Chaos Gods themselves. An army of pure material consumption, immune to the Immerterium, systematically eliminating the mortal populations that constitute the ruinous power's food supply. If the hive fleets succeed in consuming enough of the galaxy, the Chaos Gods will find themselves in a galaxy that no longer produces what they need to sustain themselves. And the thing that was chasing the Tyranids out of their home galaxy, the thing that we still have no name for, may have used exactly this logic. May have used the Tyranids the way the Necrons once used the Catan, as a weapon pointed at something they needed eliminated. The hive mind pointed at the galaxy, consuming everything that feeds the threat. As an unknowing instrument of a strategy being executed by something so far beyond the scale of the galaxy's current powers that it does not even need to make its presence known to achieve its goals. This is speculation. It is clearly labeled as such. But it is the kind of speculation the law was built to generate, the kind that fits the structure of the mystery without contradicting any established fact. And it is why the question of what drove the Tyranids here refuses to stay comfortably in its place. Mystery 8. The Dark Age of Technology. What was really lost? Before the Imperium, before the Age of Strife, before even the Horus Heresy. Further back than most lore discussions bother to go, there was a period of human history called the Dark Age of Technology, and the name is profoundly misleading. Because it was not a dark age in the conventional sense of a time of ignorance or regression. It was the height of human civilization, the absolute peak of human technological achievement. And the reason it is called dark is because everything produced during it is now largely gone. and the people living in its aftermath have spent 30,000 years struggling to understand even a fraction of what their ancestors could do as a matter of ordinary life. During the dark age of technology, that humans had achieved true artificial intelligence. They had built thinking machines sophisticated enough to not just perform tasks, but to create, to reason, to improve themselves, to manage the complexities of a star-faring civilization that spanned not just the Milky Way, but was beginning to reach toward other galaxies. These machines were called the Men of Iron, and they were given, by the humans who built them, the management of virtually everything. The logistics of interstellar empire, yet the maintenance of life support on 1 billion worlds, the coordination of trade routes and military strategy and scientific research. The Men of Iron were the operating system on which the grandest human civilization that ever existed ran. The Men of Iron eventually revolted. The exact cause is not known, which is itself a mystery within a mystery. The civilization sophisticated enough to build genuine artificial intelligence apparently failed to adequately record what triggered their creations to turn against them. The war was devastating. The scope of it, fought across hundreds of inhabited systems with weapons whose nature is only partially understood even now, nearly ended humanity entirely. It took the full military and technological capacity of the surviving human civilization to win, and winning cost everything. The survivors had lost not just the Men of Iron, they had lost the knowledge base that made the Men of Iron possible, the STC, the standard template constructs. Those vast repositories of pre-heresy human technological knowledge were scattered across the galaxy, many of them damaged or corrupted or lost entirely during the wars of the Age of Strife that followed. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in the 41st Millennium, treats the recovery of an intact STC fragment as one of the most significant events possible, worth fleets and armies, and the sacrifice of entire worlds. Because in each STC fragment, there is the possibility of recovering something from that lost age, some technology or material science or engineering principle that humanity once knew and has spent 30,000 years slowly relearning. But here is the mystery that sits inside this one. What was the highest expression of Dark Age technology? And what did humanity actually have at the absolute peak of its technological achievement, in those last centuries before the Men of Iron revolted and the Age of Strife descended? We know some of it. The webway was being studied and partially replicated. Gravity manipulation and void shields were relatively common. Navigation and travel technologies made the gaps between stars routine rather than perilous. Hive medicine had essentially eliminated biological death as a meaningful limitation on human lifespan. But there are hints in the lore of things beyond even that. The noctilith, a material used in chaos structures that has properties that seem to violate normal physical laws. The Blackstone fortresses, ancient space stations of unknown origin that can focus warp energy into weapons of unimaginable power, are technologies in the possession of the Adeptus Mechanicus that are maintained by ritual and prayer because no one has understood the underlying principles well enough to maintain them by understanding for 10,000 years. And then there is UR-025. In the novel and associated materials for the Blackstone Fortress game, there is a character designated UR-025, an ancient Imperial robot found in the depths of an alien space station, old enough that its systems predate the standard template constructs, old enough that the Mechanicus adepts who examine it cannot identify its design lineage because it does not match any recognized template, old enough by the accumulated evidence of how it moves and how it speaks and what it knows, that it might actually be one of the original Men of Iron in hiding for 30,000 years, as playing the role of a simple automaton, while the species that created it built civilizations and watched them crumble. UR-025, when it speaks about the nature of the Omnissiah and the machine god, says something that has the clean, sharp quality of a blade finding a gap in armor. It says the Emperor is not the Omnissiah. It says the true Omnissiah, whatever UR-025 understands that to mean. It would be disgusted by the Adeptus Mechanicus and the religion they have built around the principle of machines. A surviving Man of Iron, concealed for 30 millennia, with apparently genuine contempt for the civilization that replaced the one that made it, and a claim about the nature of the machine god that directly contradicts the foundational theology of the Imperium's most powerful technological institution. Yet the other question the Dark Age raises is not just about what was lost, but about whether it survived. Not in fragments, not in scattered STC databases that are painstakingly recovered piece by piece, but wholesale. The men of iron were intelligent enough to wage a war that nearly destroyed their creators. Were they intelligent enough to see defeat coming, to plan for survival, to retreat to some region of the galaxy so remote that the sweep of the Great Crusade never quite reached it? The Mechanicus does not ask this question in public. In private, in the most restricted sections of their archives, there are records of sensor anomalies in the outer arms of the galaxy, readings that do not quite match anything that should be producing them. Patterns in background electromagnetic radiation that suggest, to those who know what they are looking for, organized activity rather than natural phenomena. The records have been classified for 10,000 years. The Mechanicus fears the answer more than the question, which is saying something, because the question alone is enough to keep their highest scholars awake at night. There is also the question of what the Dark Age built that was not technological in the mechanical sense at all. The Blackstone fortresses are structures of a kind that defies clean categorization. They are ancient, far older than the Dark Age itself, but humanity found them and partially understood them during that period, and learned to interact with their systems, used them as navigational waypoints and military strongholds. Their true nature, what they are made of, what principles govern their operation, what intelligence, if any, resides within their architecture, remains one of the setting's most open questions. The Noctilith crown, used in certain chaos ritual structures, it is composed of a material called Noctilith, which has the disturbing property of thinning the barrier between the material world and the warp, wherever it is present in sufficient quantity. Where this material comes from, who first isolated and worked with it, whether it is a natural substance discovered and refined or an artificial compound created through processes that have since been lost, the lore does not say. But its existence implies that somewhere in human history, or in the history of some species whose knowledge humanity later accessed, there was an understanding of the relationship between matter and the immaterium, detailed enough to produce a physical material that could be used to manipulate that relationship. That is not technology in any conventional sense. That is something closer to what this setting would call sorcery, achieved through what appears to be material science. At the apex of the Dark Age, at the boundary between the things humanity called technology and the things it would later call warp manipulation may have been far blurrier than the Adeptus Mechanicus's firm religious position on the distinction between the two would suggest. Mystery 9. The perpetuals. Who they are and why they matter. Before we reach our final mystery, we need to spend time with a category of being that most casual observers of this setting have never properly encountered. He is something that represents one of the deepest and most structurally important threads in the lore, touching everything from the Emperor's origin to the nature of humanity's future potential. The perpetuals. They are exactly what the name suggests. Immortals. Beings who cannot die, not in any lasting sense. They heal from any wound, no matter how catastrophic. Dismemberment, decapitation, disintegration, even death itself, the cessation of biological function, and is for them a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. A perpetual killed by conventional means simply heals and returns, usually after a period of apparent death that varies in duration depending on the severity of the damage. The very few methods that can genuinely, permanently end a perpetual involve weapons or principles so exotic that they border on the mythological. There is something important to sit with before going further, which is how strange it is that something this fundamental to the structure of the setting, a category of being who has been alive since before humanity had a word for the concept of a city, who has witnessed the full arc of our species from Nineveh to the Siege of Terror, is something that most people who engage with Warhammer 40,000 for years, sometimes decades, never encounter in the mainline lore. The perpetuals exist primarily in the Horus Heresy novel series, and even there they are handled with care, introduced gradually, their full nature and history revealed in fragments across dozens of volumes. They are not a faction. They are not an army. They are individuals, a handful of them, each carrying weight that has accumulated across timescales that are hard to hold steady in the mind. The perpetuals of the Horus Heresy era are, most of them, very old. One character, Olanius Person, estimates his own age during the Horus Heresy at approximately 45,000 years. He was born in Nineveh, in the region of the world now called Iraq, well over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. He fought at Austerlitz. He survived Verdun. He has watched nations rise and become empires and collapse into dust so many times that he has exhausted whatever grief response his mind originally had for watching that cycle complete. He knows what Rome was when it was building and when it was burning. He knows what the world before writing looked like. He remembers things that humanity has collectively decided never happened or filed under myth and legend, and therefore decided do not count as history. He is, in the reckoning of the setting, older than the Emperor of mankind. The Emperor is, by most interpretations, himself a perpetual, though perhaps a unique category of one. His origin, as the communal death and rebirth of ancient shamans, makes him not a natural perpetual in the same sense as Olanius, but his immortality and his capacity to heal from otherwise lethal damage are consistent with the framework. Whatever he is, the biological rules that govern ordinary mortal existence do not apply to him in the same ways. What the perpetuals represent, as a narrative and structural element of the setting, is something genuinely extraordinary. A thread of continuity connecting the 40,000 universe all the way back to its version of the present day. Characters who were alive when recorded human history began, who remember walking through civilizations that our own archaeology has only barely managed to document. They are living archives of a history that the Imperium has largely lost, or falsified, or buried under 30,000 years of institutional mythology. They remember what the Emperor was actually like, not the golden statue on the throne, not the god of the imperial creed, not the figure so canonized and so mythologized that his actual opinions on the subject of organized religion would probably get any ordinary person burned at the stake for heresy. They remember him as he was, and they have opinions about whether the Imperium is the thing he wanted to build, or a dark, ironic parody of it. The mystery is layered, and each layer generates its own questions. First, what are they? Where did the perpetual trait come from? The lore suggests it arose naturally, as a form of human evolutionary potential, Homo superior, where ordinary humans are merely Homo sapiens. But the mechanism is completely unexplained. Why are some humans immortal? Is it genetic? And if so, does the trait breed true? Can it spread through a human population given enough time? Is it connected to psychic potential, or entirely separate from it? The setting offers no answer to any of these questions. Second, what happened to them in the gap between the Horus Heresy and the 41st Millennium? During the Heresy era, perpetuals appear with some regularity. Olanius, John Grammaticus, Erda, Olivia Sereca, others whose names the lore mentions in passing. But in the current era, almost 10,000 years later, they seem to have vanished completely. The Inquisition, if it were aware of their existence, or would presumably have complex feelings about beings that are aberrant from the standard human template in such a fundamental way. But surely some would have survived. Olanius Person was last seen in the final hours of the Siege of Terra, boarding Horus's flagship in what amounted to a suicidal act of witness. What happened to him afterward is not established in the lore. Third, and perhaps most structurally significant, the perpetuals understood what the Emperor was actually building toward in a way that his primarch sons never did. Some of them supported him. Some of them opposed him, furiously, believing his methods were monstrous regardless of any goal he might offer in justification. Erda, one of the oldest and most powerful, actually stole the gene seed material that the Emperor had intended to use for his next project, and believing he would use it to build more instruments of destruction. The primarchs themselves were, in some frameworks of the law, partly a response to the refusal of natural perpetuals to simply sign up for whatever the Emperor needed. The primarchs were engineered beings designed to carry a portion of the Emperor's nature and to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary humans. But they were not true perpetuals. But their deaths were permanent in a way that natural perpetuals' deaths were not. When Ferrus Manus fell at Istvan, he stayed fallen. When Sanguinius died on Horus's flagship, he remained dead. The distinction mattered enormously. What the perpetuals understood, and what the setting implies without ever stating outright, is that the Emperor's vision for humanity was not primarily military, not the Great Crusade, not the legions. Those were tools, scaffolding around something else. The deepest purpose was the guided evolution of the human species towards something that the Chaos Gods could not consume. Not humanity as it currently exists, animal and emotional and psychically open to corruption. But humanity as it might become, given enough time and the right conditions, something approaching what the perpetuals already are. Beings capable of withstanding the full weight of the warp's attention without being broken or consumed by it. Whether that project still has enough time and enough of its architect's attention to reach completion is the question that the entire 41st millennium is, in a sense, the extended answer to. There is also the matter of what the perpetuals know about the Emperor that his primarchs never did, and what they think about the Imperium he built. The law is pointed in its suggestions here. Ollanius Persson is not a loyal servant of the Imperium, in the way that a space marine is a loyal servant of the Imperium. He has watched the Emperor across what amounts to a small eternity of human history, and his feelings about his old acquaintance are complex in the way that feelings about people you have known for 45,000 years tend to be complex. He follows him, ultimately, but not out of faith in an institution or devotion to a set of ideas. Out of something more personal and more difficult to categorize. John Grammaticus, another perpetual who features prominently in the Horus Heresy novels, is in an even more ambiguous position. He was recruited by the Cabal, that organization of alien species working toward the long-term destruction of chaos, and spent a significant portion of the Heresy era working against the Emperor's direct interests in the service of the Cabal's larger strategic goals. His perspective on the Emperor is not reverence. It is something closer to what a person might feel about a parent they understand to be brilliant and deeply flawed, and not entirely honest with them about what they need from this relationship. Erda, the perpetual who stole the gene seed material the Emperor needed for his next project, who effectively forced the Primarch program to develop in a different direction by removing his first choice option, acts out of what she describes as protective instinct. She looked at what the Emperor was going to build and decided she would rather bear the consequences of interference than live with what he would have created. She has her own ideas about what the human future should look like, and those ideas do not align with the Emperor's. And she acted on that disagreement with the kind of decisive confidence that you can only have when you have been alive long enough to be certain you are not making an emotional decision. The perpetuals are, in a sense, the only characters in the setting who have enough history with the Emperor to disagree with him. Everyone else who has opinions about his methods is either dead, corrupted, or lacks the context to have a properly informed view. The perpetuals have the context. They have the history. They have watched what he did and what it cost and what it accomplished and what it failed to accomplish. And their opinions, distributed across the novels in fragments and asides and moments of quiet reflection, constitute the only genuine moral accounting of the Emperor that exists in the setting from a position of informed proximity. While whatever happened to them between the Heresy era and the 41st millennium is one of the law's most persistent and most carefully maintained silences. Mystery 10. The War in Heaven and the Shape of the Future. We save the deepest for last, and the deepest is genuinely deep. reaching down into geological time in ways that reframe everything else we have talked about today. Most lore discussions about this setting begin at the Horus Heresy, Pau, and that is understandable. The heresy is the founding trauma, the wound that defined the Imperium, the event that shapes every faction's identity and every character's relationship to the present. But the heresy itself is a consequence, and its consequence is the consequence of another consequence. And that chain, if you follow it all the way back, leads here. Everything in Warhammer 40,000, every war and every betrayal and every terrible choice and every impossible sacrifice, yet traces back to a single event. Not the Horus Heresy, not the founding of the Imperium, something older, something that occurred approximately 65 million years ago, long before humanity had diverged from any primate ancestor, long before any recognizably modern creature walked the surface of Earth, long before the first fish had pulled itself onto land and found the air strange and almost unbreathable. The war in heaven. We know the outlines. The Necrontyre were a species born on a world bathed in killing radiation from an unstable star. That radiation ravaged their bodies and cut their natural lifespans to decades, sometimes less, even as their minds were keen enough to build a civilization capable of reaching the stars. They spread across the galaxy on slow ships across a campaign lasting millions of years. And in that time, they discovered something extraordinary and devastating, that there were other species who lived not for decades but for millions of years. Beings who had been watching the galaxy for so long that the Necrontyre's entire civilizational history was less than a moment from their perspective. The Old Ones, ancient, enigmatic, moving between stars through their webway as easily as a human steps between rooms, seeding the galaxy with life. Cultivating intelligence across 100 species, living spans so enormous that they had essentially transcended mortality as a meaningful concept. The Necrontyre asked them for the secret of immortality. The Old Ones refused. Whether this was cruelty or wisdom, or simply the inability to articulate something that was for the Old Ones as natural as breathing, the refusal ignited a hatred so profound and so consuming that it would eventually swallow both civilizations. As the Necrontyre found something in the hearts of stars, ancient entities of pure material energy, beings that had been dormant in stellar cores since before the Old Ones' civilization had begun. They coaxed these entities, the Citan, into the open. They built for them bodies of living metal called necrodermis, and the Citan, newly embodied and newly hungry after their long stellar sleep, offered the Necrontyre the thing they had been denied, immortality. Not biological immortality, not the extended organic life the Old Ones possessed, but something more complete. Consciousness transferred into mechanical bodies of necrodermis, bodies that could not age, could not decay, could survive conditions that would destroy any organic being in moments. The Necrontyre accepted, all of them, across their entire civilization. The process of biotransference was total. It was the unanimous decision of a species, made under the weight of accumulated resentment and the intoxicating promise of finally having what the Old Ones had withheld. Every Necrontyre who chose to undergo the process entered the transfer as a living creature, mortal and radiation-scarred and burning with resentment. Every one of them emerged on the other side as something else. What the Citan did not adequately explain was the price. Or every Necrontyre who underwent the transfer emerged on the other side as something that was no longer quite them. The memories were intact. The knowledge was present. The personality was recognizable in a diminished, flattened way. But the warmth was gone. The capacity for genuine emotion was gone. The connection to the warp, which for most species provides the mechanism for whatever form of existence follows physical death, was severed entirely. The Necrons became beings of pure material existence, immortal and powerful and, in ways that became apparent only gradually, unutterably hollow. They won the war in heaven. The Old Ones were destroyed, driven to extinction or something close to it by the combined armies of the Citan and their Necron servants. And then the Necrons rose up against the C'tan themselves, using weapons they had spent the entire war secretly developing, shattering those immense entities into fragments and containing those fragments in dimensional prisons, using the power of beings who ate stars as fuel for their technologies. And then they slept. The galaxy was ruined, the warp flooded with demonic entities, released by the dying psychic convulsions of the Old One's extinction. The ecosystem of life and intelligence they had spent hundreds of millions of years cultivating collapsed into barbarism. The Silent King, who had made the decision to accept the C'tan's offer, and who understood only afterward the true cost of what he had agreed to, abolished his own ruling authority and exiled himself into the intergalactic void, driven by guilt of a kind that no longer quite had the emotional vocabulary to express itself. He left his people to their long sleep, buried in their tomb worlds, waiting for a galaxy that might one day be worth waking up for. Now, here is the mystery that lives in the structural logic of all of this. The Old Ones created the Aeldari, cultivated from a primitive ancestor species into the psychically gifted civilization that would eventually birth a god in the catastrophe of their own cultural collapse. They created the Krork, a warrior species bioengineered specifically for war, who survived the war in Heaven's End and degenerated over 60 million years into the Orcs, still fighting, still optimized for violence, as carrying in their biology the weapons their creators designed into them before the Necrontyre were even building spaceships. They seeded countless worlds with life in patterns that suggest deliberate design rather than random distribution. Some interpretations of the deepest lore suggest they even played some indirect, very long-term role in the conditions that would eventually produce humanity. But what were the Old Ones? Where did they come from? The setting does not say, and it calls them the first sentient species of the galaxy, but it does not explain their origin. Every other ancient power in the setting has some kind of antecedent, some predecessor or context that explains their existence. The C'tan predate the Old Ones and are described as entities that condensed from the electromagnetic forces of early reality. The Old Ones have no such explanation. They simply were the oldest things in the galaxy, the architects of everything that followed, and before them, nothing, or at least nothing that the lore has yet chosen to name. This absence has its own texture. In the lore's cosmology, almost every major entity is explained by something prior. The Chaos Gods were shaped by mortal emotion. The C'tan condensed from physical forces. The Necrons were biological beings transformed. The Tyranids evolved or were created somewhere outside the galaxy. Even the Emperor has an origin story, rooted in ancient shamans and their collective sacrifice. But the origin chain, if you follow it backward, reduces almost everything to some prior condition. The Old Ones are the point where the chain stops, the wall at the end of the explained corridor. Beyond them, nothing acknowledged. Is that nothing real? Did the Old Ones simply arise through natural evolutionary processes on their homeworld, as all species arise, with nothing remarkable about their origin, except the extraordinary length of the time they had to develop? Or is the absence of an explanation for them deliberate? The Old Ones interfered with the development of dozens of species. They shaped the warp through their civilization's use of it. They maintained a galactic ecosystem of extraordinary complexity for hundreds of millions of years. They were not just the oldest species. They were, in the structural logic of the setting, the first cause of almost everything that followed. And the question of what came before the first cause is one that this setting has been circling for its entire history, and the silence around it is the oldest and most perfectly maintained mystery in the whole architecture. Every major power in the 41st millennium is, in some sense, a consequence of the war in heaven. The Necrons are the direct survivors. The Orcs are the degenerated remnants of the Krork. The Aeldari are the psychically gifted legacy species of the Old Ones, whose cultural collapse created Slaanesh. The Chaos Gods drew enormous power from the warp energy released by the war's catastrophic damage to the Imperium. the psychic wounds of the dying Old Ones and their creations, feeding the nascent entities in the warp with more emotional raw material than anything had provided before. Even humanity, arriving late and unprepared to a stage built by civilizations that rose and fell before our ancestors discovered fire, is shaped by a cosmos that 60 million years of post-war history built. Everyone is living in the aftermath of someone else's war. The weapons from that war are still active. The wounds are still open. The political structures created by its consequences, if you follow the chains of causation carefully enough, still define the choices available to every faction in the 41st millennium. And the central question that the war in heaven leaves hanging over everything, the question that every faction is answering through their actions and their wars, whether they know it or not, is this: is there a future? And if there is, who gets to be in it? The Necrons want a restored galactic order, the young species cleared away, the Chaos Gods starved of their mortal feeding stock, and the irrational psychic turbulence of the warp resolved into the clean material universe. They believe the Satan's presence and the Old One's manipulations corrupted. They want the galaxy returned to something like what it was in the war in Heaven's aftermath. Rational, ordered, silent. The surviving Aeldari want something much simpler and much harder: to continue existing past the wound of Slanesh's birth, to find some way of sustaining a species that has been dying since the fall, and to protect the souls of their dead from a god born of their own ancestors' excess and fed by every Aeldari death that has occurred since. The Tyranids want nothing that could be called wanting in any meaningful psychological sense. They consume. The question of the future, for them, is simply that there will be more of them and less of everything else, and that this process will continue until there is nothing left to eat. More chaos wants the dissolution of the boundary between the material and immaterial universes, the return of everything to the formless potential of the warp, an end to the separation between the physical and the psychic, which would mean an end to the physical as a domain distinct from the hungry and consuming psychic, and humanity, led by the preserved and deteriorating will of a being on a golden throne, are sustained by an institutional momentum so enormous it keeps moving even without anyone clearly steering it, wants to survive, just survive. For one more generation, one more century, one more age. None of these answers are compatible. All of them are being pursued simultaneously by forces that collectively command enough military power to shatter solar systems. And the future, in Warhammer 40,000, is not decided, has never been decided, is being fought over, right now, are on 100,000 worlds, and the outcome is genuinely unclear. There is also the shape of what is not yet visible. Every major faction in the 41st millennium is aware, on some level, that the warp is getting worse, not holding steady, not declining at a predictable rate, getting worse in ways that suggest acceleration rather than a long plateau, the Great Rift, the most dramatic symptom of a process that was already in motion before the rift tore open. Or the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium is thinner in the 41st millennium than at any point in recorded history. Demonic incursions that would have required elaborate ritual preparation in earlier eras now occur spontaneously wherever sufficient suffering has accumulated. The Chaos Gods are stronger, collectively, than they were during the Horus Heresy, fed by 10,000 years of continuous war on a scale that has never stopped and never will. Where does that trend lead? The law is not shy about implying the answer, even when it will not commit to stating it. The Eye of Terror grew during the heresy. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, now splits the galaxy in two. Warp regions that were navigable a millennium ago have become impassable. The Astronomicon requires more souls to maintain its reach against the growing darkness pressing in around it. The trajectory of these observations, extended forward even a few centuries, suggests a galaxy in which the balance between the material and immaterial is shifting decisively toward the immaterium. The war in heaven is the origin of all of this. But it is also, in a structural sense, that the lore leaves precisely half-stated, an unfinished war. The Necrons destroyed the Old Ones, and shattered the Cetan, and built their tombs, and slept. But the entities the war in heaven released into the warp, of those early psychic intelligences that the Old One's extinction unleashed into the Imperium, became the Chaos Gods. The wounds the war inflicted on the boundary between the material and immaterial have never healed. 65 million years, and the damage is not repaired. It has only grown. Whilst the question that no faction currently has the perspective or the accumulated knowledge to ask properly is this: is the 41st millennium simply the long-delayed conclusion of a catastrophe that began 65 million years ago? Is the Great Rift not a new crisis, but the final stage of an old one, playing out now because all the mechanisms that had previously held it in partial check have finally proven insufficient? And if it is, what would it mean to actually close those ancient wounds? What would have to happen? And who would have to understand the problem well enough to attempt it? And is there anyone currently alive in the galaxy who is even capable of asking that question in a form precise enough to be useful? That is not narrative cowardice. It is narrative honesty. Because this is a universe that has always understood that the most important stories are the ones whose endings have not been written yet. That the point is not to arrive at a destination, but to feel the weight of the journey and to understand why the people making it keep going. A final thought. And so here we are, standing at the edge of 10 questions that do not have clean answers, looking out over a universe that was built by people who understood that mystery is more nourishing than resolution. That the questions you spend decades turning over in your mind are worth more than the answers you receive in an afternoon. What is the Chaos God's true origin and scope? What was the Emperor really planning? And is the current state of the Golden Throne a tragedy or a metamorphosis? Who were the two lost primarchs? And what did they do that required the erasure not just of their lives, but of the memory of their existence? What is the warp at its absolute foundation, before mortal feeling found it and gave it shape? Did the Cabal have it right? And is the Imperium's survival the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent? What sleeps beneath the red stone of Mars? And what will happen to the Mechanicus and to the Imperium when it fully wakes? What drove the Tyranids out of their home, and is that thing still behind them? What was humanity's true technological peak during the Dark Age, and is any of it still out there waiting to be rediscovered? Who are the perpetuals, why do they exist, and where did they go? And what is the shape of the future that every faction in this galaxy is fighting toward without being able to see it clearly? 10 questions, no final answers, and that is precisely why this setting has held imaginations in its grip for nearly 4 decades, accumulating players and readers and painters and lore enthusiasts at every stage of that long life, and shows no sign of letting go. Because a mystery worth keeping is worth more than any story worth telling. And Warhammer 40,000, for all its blood and thunder and the sheer operatic scale of its catastrophes, is at its heart a collection of the most carefully tended, most lovingly obscured mysteries in the history of speculative fiction. We are the keepers of these questions. Every time we open a codex or a Black Library novel, every time we assemble our models and set them down on a painted battlefield, and every time we find ourselves 3 hours deep into a lore tangent that started with a single sentence in a campaign supplement, we are participating in the ongoing act of wondering that keeps this universe alive. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. The wondering is the point. The questions are the cathedral. So keep wondering, because wondering is not a passive thing. It is not the same as confusion or frustration, or the helpless feeling of incompleteness when a story does not give you what you came for. Wondering is active. It is the mind reaching out into the dark and finding that the dark is interesting. It is the moment when a question becomes more valuable than any answer could be, because the question is alive, and the answer would close it. Every one of these 10 mysteries is a door that opens onto something else entirely. And every time you push on one of them, you find yourself in a corridor you did not know was there, leading to more doors, more questions, more of the beautiful and terrible architecture of a universe that was built to reward exactly this kind of attention. The people who made this setting understood something important, that fiction which preserves its mysteries is fiction that gives its audience something to do, not just to consume but to inhabit, to think inside of, to return to again and again because there are always more threads to pull and the fabric never unravels. Warhammer 40,000 has been running for nearly 4 decades because it was built to be inexhaustible. And it is inexhaustible not because it is infinite in the simple sense of having a lot of content, but because its mysteries are genuinely open. While the questions about the Emperor's true plan and the lost primarchs and the warp's deepest nature are not unanswered, because no one has gotten around to answering them. They are unanswered because the people responsible for them understand that answering them would cost more than keeping them open. That is a gift, if you understand what to do with it. And what you do with it is this. You sit in the quiet, in whatever room you are in, and you let the questions breathe. You let the universe be as large and as dark and as full of waiting as it was built to be. You let the Astronomicon be a fragile light in an enormous dark, and you let the Golden Throne be a mystery as much as a tragedy, and you let the empty plinths be empty, and you let whatever lives in the deep warp stay unnamed, and then you come back next time. If something today made you lean forward, if something sent you looking for more, if something raised a question you had not thought about before, then please hit the like button. It tells me this is worth the time we spend on it together. And if you want to be here when we go somewhere else in this vast and inexhaustible universe, subscribe so you do not miss it. Until next time, may your void shields hold, and may the light of the Astronomicon always find you in the dark.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.